Um, so just as we get started, this webinar is being recorded and it will get uploaded onto our website. So if you don't want your face on it, then do turn your camera off. But also, as Carl said, don't turn your camera off. It's nice to see everybody. So for those of you that aren't aware, this webinar is part of the Wilder Future for Warwickshire project. The project is a 2-year project that's funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and it is giving training and learning in ecology, conservation, environmentalism, along with marketing, communications and campaigning, with the hope that as part of the training and the learning, you guys will then have the skills and the tools to go out and inspire and engage some of your peers. So if anyone has any questions about the project, then feel free to drop me an email afterwards. But I'm just going to hand straight over to Carl, who's going to get us cracking on foxes today. We will have a break at roughly halfway through and then have some questions. But if you want to use the chat and ask questions in the chat, then feel free to, or we can save them to the end. It's completely up to you guys. Take it away, Carl.
Thank you. Yes, just to reiterate, we will have a break. I appreciate we're going to go through quite a lot when we talk about foxes today. If you've got questions at any point, please put them in the chat. I'd rather answer them as we go along than save them up at the end. You might forget them. So hello, I'm Carl Soulsbury. I am a senior lecturer at the University of Lincoln. I've been studying foxes for nearly 20 years. I haven't quite got to the 20-year anniversary of foxes. I know I don't look it. I've aged well, but I think this pandemic will age me even further. I started off studying foxes purely because I was passionate about particularly wild carnivores, but actually really specifically about foxes. And I spent nearly 10 years studying their ecology in the wild, particularly urban foxes, but I also did some work on rural foxes. I also helped manage a national survey of foxes that took place in 2006. So I have a range of experience, not just of the UK foxes, but I've also done some work on them around the world. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about the red fox, our native species, and I'm going to talk to you about them globally with a focus on the UK, but I'm going to bring in some information that's really quite relevant and important about the UK fox in that kind of global perspective. And as I say, just pop anything into the chat as we go along if you've got any specific questions. I will be able to see them even if I'm not looking at my my PDF. So bear with me, I'm going to share my PDF. 2 seconds, it will catch up with everything. You should be able to see it. And I can see Joanna nodding, so I can still see some faces down the side. Feel free to put anything, not just in the chat, you can also turn your microphone as well, but as that warning comes, you will be recorded. So, welcome. I hope by the end of today, you come away with a different understanding of the fox as a species, perhaps appreciating it as a remarkably adaptable species, if not one of the most remarkably adaptable species that exists in the wild. And also understand a little bit of where it's misunderstood. There's a lot of myths surrounding red foxes, a lot of mistruths that are spoken by even seasoned naturalists. So understanding a little bit about their behaviour, their ecology, and really understanding them more as a species. If we educate people about a species, they're more likely to not be in conflict with them. So I'm actually going to start with a kind of actually interactive piece. These are all a bunch of wild canid species from around the world. Some you might recognize, some you might not. So to get your brains flowing, put in the chat any species that you recognize out of these 7 here. Which ones do you know? Which ones do you not know? Go on, Anne, type some in there. There's obviously right and wrong answers here, but I'm not going to judge you if you get them horrifically wrong. I will say that I did run a similar quiz, not this year, but with my first year ecology and conservation students in Lincoln. And I did put a picture of a red fox up and asked them what species it was. And nobody answered. I asked again and somebody said, it's an Arctic fox. And I died a little inside when they couldn't identify a red fox. So we've got a fennec fox. Joanna's straight in there. Which one is it?
It's the little one with the big ears.
Yeah, it's a fennec fox, a desert species. Anyone that recognise anything else that's on there? There are some obscure species. As I say, don't be shy. Chuck it in the chat. Bottom right is a red fox. Yep, brilliant. Any down the centre you might recognise. That bottom centre one is actually quite important. It's an invasive species in Europe. It is a potential invasive species for the UK. It has been found in the wild in the UK. It's one of the species on a watch list from DEFRA. It's quite an important invasive species. Anybody? Don't be shy. Don't be shy.
It looks a bit like a raccoon type thing.
Okay.
Obviously not a raccoon, but
So it looks like a raccoon, but it's a dog. What might it be called?
raccoon dog.
Brilliant. There we go. It's a raccoon dog. Yep. It's not a raccoon. It is a dog. It's a canid. But yes, it gets its name from looking like a raccoon. They're called tanuki in Japan, and they're seen as being mischievous fertility symbols. If you type in tanuki and see some statues, you kind of get the impression what they accentuate for the fertility signal. Any of the other ones? There's 4 more on there. I'll give you 10 seconds. If there's no more chat, I don't mind.
Is one of them the Arctic fox, the one in the middle left?
No.
No.
No. Good guess, but no. So starting with the centre one at the top, that's a bat-eared fox from South Africa. Top left is a grey fox from North America. Central left, is a Darwin's fox from the island Chiloé off the coast of Chile. It also exists on the mainland in a small population. And the bottom one is Zorro from South America. The common feature they all have is they bear the name fox. In reality, some of these are not foxes and some of them are true foxes, so to speak. So the name of fox, just to note, is applied to any small kind of pointy-eared dog. It doesn't necessarily make it a true fox. The ones down the left, the grey fox, the Darwin's fox and the Zorro there, they belong to a completely different group of South American canids, with the grey fox being perhaps the most primitive. If you actually look at the dentition, the grey fox has got a dentition which is very, very similar to an insectivorous mammal. It's very, very generalised, very pointy. I've actually got a grey fox skull that if you want to see at the end, I can dig it out and show you. But they belong to the grey fox is a very primitive offshoot. The other ones are actually more closely related to wolves. So the name is misapplied. The true foxes are the other 4. So the bat-eared fox, the raccoon dog, the fennec fox and the red fox. And both the raccoon dog and the bat-eared fox are really early offshoots of the true foxes. They don't look really like the other ones. You can see the raccoon dog's got rounded ears, it's short and stocky, it looks very different, but they are part of the true fox family. Whereas the red fox and the fennec fox are perhaps what we more prototypically think as a true fox. And those are the biggest and the smallest of the family. So the biggest true fox is the red fox, and the smallest true fox is the desert fennec fox. So I'm really putting this here just to say is that the name fox is often misapplied. It actually specifically relates to a group of canids known as the vulpines, the vulpinini, the vulpine foxes. So what else do we know? So the red fox actually has the largest geographical distribution of any wild land animal. Now you're all probably going, what about the mouse? What about the rat? Well, believe it or not, things like the rat often are a group of species. If you go to Southeast Asia, it's the Polynesian rat. It's a different species that's common there. So it may look the same, they're actually different species. The red fox has the widest distribution of any wild land animal. The only animals with bigger distributions are either domesticated, so domestic cats, domestic dogs, humans themselves, or actually marine mammals. There are some marine mammals that have got pan-global distributions. So these red foxes are pretty adaptable. And straight away, you can see that they're pretty much found in almost every habitat. They're found up in the extreme far north, towards the edge of true ice tundra, into the desert regions of Australia, for example, the edge of the desert in Africa, and they're even found in tropical forest. I have to put hand on heart, we know almost nothing of the red fox as a species in tropical forest. We just don't know anything about them. We know they're recorded on camera traps, they're recorded from DNA and scats and recorded specimens, but we couldn't tell you anything about their ecology, whether it's different or similar to that species across the rest of the region. But just to really take this away, they are incredibly adaptable as a species. That adaptability transmits throughout their ecology. So whether they live as a breeding pair in the Arctic tundra, quite a low productive environment, very little food in the Arctic tundra, a pair of red foxes will range over hundreds and hundreds of square kilometers. There's been some really cool work recently looking at movements of foxes away from their parental range in a process called a dispersal. We're going to come to that later. Some of these foxes will move thousands of kilometers. So another thing that they're really good at is recolonizing areas, very, very long distance movements. So Arctic tundra is obviously an extreme. In desert regions, again, a very low productive environment. They can live in large territories. They need these large territories to be able to access food. They don't necessarily always live in pairs. They can live in family groups, but they can adapt to a very, very low productive environment. One thing that these desert red foxes have is competition from other canid species in deserts. So there are a bunch of closely related species that are desert adapted, not just fennec foxes, but other things such as Blandford's fox and Brupell's fox, very closely related. They're a bit smaller than red foxes, but they actually all compete with each other for resources. So there's a bit more resource competition in desert areas. So those are two of the really extreme environments. But then there is probably the ultimate extreme environment, and actually the environment where perhaps foxes have been most successful, and that's the urban environment. We shouldn't forget that there are few animals as successful as an urban species as red foxes. Are there subspecies of red foxes in a different climates? It's a good question. I'm going to come a little bit to kind of that adaptability in a minute, so hopefully I'll address it, but it's a really good question. Urban foxes in not just Britain, Europe, they're found throughout the world, for example. They're often at really, really high densities. Their territories can be as small as half a square kilometre. The smallest territories I've recorded have been as low as 20 hectares. So tiny, tiny little home ranges, you know, handfuls of gardens where these animals will live. And often they're living not just as pairs, but there may be several animals occupying that same territory. So really high densities in very, very small territories. And we're going to deal a little bit specifically with urban foxes later, but super adaptable. The one thing that unifies this is essentially a flexibility in every aspect of their life, a flexibility in their diet, a flexibility in their social behavior and their social life, and an adaptability in terms of their phenotype as well. Are we all familiar with the term phenotype? If someone says no, that's good, because I can explain it. If you all say yes, even better. It allows me to take a sip of tea. So I don't see anything in the chat. By phenotype, I mean their body shape and their morphology. Their behaviour as well is also a part of their phenotype, but specifically their body shape and their morphology is incredibly flexible. So really it depends on where you live. If you're going to live in a cold environment, you're going to need a lovely fluffy coat. These are actually Japanese foxes in a Japanese fox farm. This is not a place where they farm them for their fur, it's where people go to cuddle them. And who wouldn't want to cuddle them, to be honest? If I'm really honest, that's a really good place to have some nasty disease transmission. I'm going to talk about diseases later on, but yeah, I'd be very careful about cuddling a fox. The one on the right is a fox from a desert region. And you can see it's got a very short, sparse coat. It's got large ears for allowing the heat to be passed into the environment. It's a more paler, sandy colour. So you can see that they change dramatically phenotypically depending on where they're found. You find those ones in cold climates, those ones in desert environments. They also differ massively in body size. And there are few animals out there, few mammals out there with such a variation in body size. The smallest adult foxes that I know of, I've got a big data set that I've been analysing, the smallest adult red foxes are 1.5 kilos. So, you know, get your bags of sugar out. These are pocket foxes. Typically they're found in the desert regions, small, arid, low productivity. Biggest foxes tend to be found in the northern boreal forests, 8 to 9 kilos. 10 kilos would be extreme, but averages, we're talking an average weight of about 8 kilos in places like Sweden and Norway, wouldn't be unusual. These are the same species. They're not different. They are just adapted to their environment. Here in the UK, a 6 kilo to 6.5 kilo male would be much more normal. 8 kilos would be extreme. The largest fox I ever caught was actually a 9 kilo female. And she said there was something in that family line for big foxes because her mum, the vixen, was 7.8 kilos. Both of those were extremely large for a female. Must have been something where they lived as well. I want to put it in context because I quite often get asked, what does that mean, 4 or 5 kilos? I get people ringing me up and going, I've seen a fox the size of an Alsatian. Foxes are tiny. I really want to hasten to add, they're much smaller than you imagine. They are a long-limbed species, but they have very little fat. They're very slim. They're lightweight for their body size. So the average range of most adult foxes in the UK would be in that 4 to 6 kilo range. There's a sexual dimorphism. The males are slightly larger. An average female would be 5 to 5.5 kilos. The average male is 6 to 6.5 kilos. But I've had females that are huge, that 9 kilo female, that have her mum, which was 7.6. I've had males, adult male foxes that are 4 kilos. So again, really tiny pocket-sized ones. To put it in context, an average medium-sized dog, my dog's a collie breed, not this kind, she weighs 20 kilos, 20 kilos. So an average sized dog is about 3 to 4 times the body weight of a fox. They don't look it if you had them side by side. They don't look it in terms of, but dogs are massive. And in fact, there's a lot of body overweight and body size with domestic cats. So any idea that red foxes are active predators of domestic cats, they're not. They may take old cats, they may take kittens. I'm not going to sit here and say they don't eat cats, but it's rare in comparison to the number of cats. There's just simply not the risk. I don't know if anyone's ever picked up an angry cat. I've got both fox scars and I've got domestic cat scars. And the domestic cat scars were a lot more painful than the fox. Fox weren't very nice either, to be honest. A cat is pretty good at defending itself. So the fox would be completely stupid to take advantage. At the end, when I stop sharing this, I'll actually show you the difference in size based on skulls as well. So I've got a wolf skull from Mongolia that I collected. I've got a coyote skull from North America, and I've got some large male foxes that I've collected from my study site. So I can show you the difference really in their size, and particularly the weight of the bones and the cranium. You know, they're very light and delicate foxes. The other thing that varies is their coat colour. So you can see from this range of photographs, they're not always that lovely, beautiful orangey red colour. In North America, they tend to have 3 different colour morphs that are quite common, particularly in Canada. They have the standard orangey red colour that we see. They have this beautiful black fox with white tips. They call this a silver fox. We occasionally get silver foxes in this country. You'll often see it in the media. Rare subspecies, they're not. If we see them in this country, I bet my money that it comes either from a domestic origin or it's got a captive genes from some point in the past. Silver foxes are very common in fur farming because of their beautiful coats, sadly. But it is a wild phenotype. It's very common in Canada. And the other colour is this central middle one, this one with a kind of blacky face. And they're known as cross foxes. They have a dorsal and a sagittal, dorsal and a sagittal ridge of black fur. So down the spine is this black ridge of guard fur, and then they've got one that goes straight across their shoulders. When you look down on it, it looks like a cross. The cross fox and the silver fox are rare in the UK. As I say, in North America, more common. You've got the paler sandy colours that you often get in desert regions. And then you have things like the cinnamon coloured, which again can be found in the wild, but is often selected for artificially. So that's a fur farm. And that beautiful white one at the bottom, again, that's a fur farm variant. I do have some pictures later on of piebald foxes as well, but I'll come to what they are slightly later. But again, just very plastic, size, shape, colour, behaviour, they're all incredibly flexible. You can see why they start to be so successful as a species. So I'm going to get on to slightly onto Becca's question here about subspecies and how they vary. So about 50, 60 years ago, it was put forward that there were actually 2 species of red fox. There was a North American species and a kind of more widespread Eurasian species. The evidence for this North American species was pretty woolly, if I'm brutally honest. They are slightly smaller. They tend to be smaller on average. So the males tend to be 5.5 kilos to 6 rather than, I say, 6 to 6.5. There were some slight differences in their molars and slight cranial differences, but we weren't sure. If you'd asked me when I started my work and my PhD, frankly, they're just foxes. I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But actually, having now worked on the differences between the 2 species, I can tell you. I can tell you which one. I can tell you from which region these foxes come from in this picture. And they are very subtle differences. So one of the questions that had been bugging me when I started my PhD is basically, are they really different? What was the underlying genetics? So I started a collaboration with some colleagues in Ireland and then North America. And we went out and we collected a crazy amount of fox DNA. Or basically, we collected bits of dead fox. And I had quite a lot from the UK. These are all of our sampling locations around the world. And I hasten to add, I did not get to visit anywhere actually on this map apart from Britain. I didn't even get to go to Ireland. Isn't that really disappointing? I'd love to have gone some of these places. What we did is we actually looked at 2 parts of the fox genome. We looked at a part known as the mitochondrial DNA. And this is a part that's passed down from mother to cub, not down the father line. It is very invariable and is often used to look at lineages, long-term lineages. But we also looked at the Y chromosome as well to look at the males. And what we can see here, based on the colours, is known as lineage sharing. So where you've got the same colour, you've got the same lineage of fox in the long term. And you can see there are 4 colours there. A very, very, very difficult to see yellow one, because there's not very much of it. A red one, and the 2 really common yellow and green ones. So to start with, you can see that in North America, we have largely got this blue, this Nearctic clade. The evidence from the DNA told us that these blue, in this case on the figure, these blue foxes belong to a completely different lineage of foxes to the rest. And actually what we'd actually found is that these foxes had become isolated during the last glaciation. So the glacial period in across the world started about 150,000 years ago, and we'd be having periods of hot and cold, periods of ice caps, periods of low glaciation, backwards and forwards. About 150,000 years ago, the foxes in North America became split from the rest. And that's because there was this massive ice sheet that sat across most of Canada. So this blue lineage represented foxes isolated towards the south into sort of Texas and Florida area. The foxes in Europe were isolated as well. They tended to be isolated down into southern Europe, into India. And when those ice sheets started to melt, they spread. What we actually found is that movement of foxes across the Bering Strait. So that Eurasian haplotype, that Eurasian fox, spread into North America, but was only ever common in Alaska and the very, very far northwest of Canada. So if you answer the question, is there really a North American red fox? Yes, kind of. It depends a little bit where you are. And actually, if you break this down, North America has lots and lots of subspecies of red fox that we don't really have in Eurasia. People love splitting up red foxes into different groups. I think there's about 30 subspecies, but genetically speaking, there's not as many. But North America has loads of really micro subspecies that have been isolated, often in valleys or in mountain ranges because of glaciation. So the picture's a lot more different across there. The other thing to note from this image,
Here he is. Here he is.
someone's got their mic on.
Yeah, why? It's the again. Oh, yeah.
Can you mute them, Joanna? Brilliant. So the other thing to note is there are these two ancient clades in Africa and in Arabia. And these were basal to all red foxes. So this is evidence that the red fox as a species evolved is somewhere in North Africa and Arabia. And in fact, that's supported by fossil evidence. The really first fossil red foxes are found in, I think, in either Morocco or Algeria. So the red fox itself actually evolved as a North African species and then moved out into Europe and ultimately into North America, where they were then split. So as a species, they come from that. And actually, if you go to North Africa, that is where there's lots of other vulpine species. There's a Ruppel's fox, there is the fennec fox, there is the Blandford's fox, and to the south there's something called a Cape fox. So there's a lot of diversity there, and the red fox was the one that spread out and was successful. Now the last thing the eagle-eyed people would be asking about is Australia. They're British, they're expats. Sadly, we exported British red foxes all the way across into Australia. They're all ours. There's no other mixture from any other part of the world. They're just, unfortunately, British. So it's our problem. So to go back to Becca's really good question, are there subspecies? Yes. There's actually probably, if not two species of red fox, there's at least two really big subspecies, the northern North American subspecies and the Eurasian. Within the North American, there are some specialized subspecies that are really to specific areas and different regions. Oh, that's slightly mangled that PDF. Normally I had this as a PowerPoint. So just to point out that there are clear differences you can see. They're slightly smaller. There are these cranial differences. And the other thing is that they have slightly different reproductive biology. And so they tend to have larger litters as well. It would be more normal for a North American fox to have 6 cubs, whereas 4 is more normal. That's a good question here. It seems to be unidirectional, Daniel. It's a good question. So there was a land bridge that formed as the sea levels were lower. And as the ice caps melted, the first part of North America that was accessible was that northwestern corridor up there. So the Eurasian foxes could spread across the Bering Strait and recolonize it. There's no evidence of any transfer from North America outwards. And what we do find as well is that it's the maternal lineage, but not the paternal lineage, that's moved across. And so it seems that female foxes were able to move in and breed and perhaps hybridize with North American males, but it doesn't seem that the Eurasian males were successful in coming across and breeding. So it's a bit more dynamic in that. But yes, it was because there was a land bridge. So that's the global picture. What about Europe? And I've actually published 3 papers on this, on Europe. It's complicated because Europe, of course, has a long history of fox translocation as well. We do like moving species around, but foxes in particular, we've moved around an awful lot. The first thing to know is that foxes are actually fairly adaptable to cold climates. And we extracted DNA from fossil foxes throughout France and relatively far into Northern Europe. And what we found is that the DNA in those foxes was the same as the DNA of the foxes we find now. So we're not dealing with different subpopulations that came in later. We're dealing with a population that's been continuously present in some regions, even during the height of the glacial period. The foxes in both Britain and Ireland are most closely related to the foxes around the Low Countries in Europe, particularly Denmark and Belgium. And that would fit with where the last connecting land bridge between Europe and Britain was. So there seems to be plausible gene flow. When we do analysis on this, we can actually look at how far back the populations have been separated. And it suggests that British foxes were isolated from Europe about 6,000 years ago, which again fits with when the land bridge across Dogger Bank was broken. We see 2 other really interesting patterns. So firstly, in Iberia, you'll notice in the picture of Spain, there's a lot of yellow color. Iberian foxes would have been pushed into Iberia during the glacial period. So they've been isolated because of an ice sheet sitting across the Pyrenees. And the Iberian foxes never left. So those Iberian foxes have been largely restricted to the Iberian Peninsula throughout the glacial period, and they've never moved out. Most of the other foxes in Europe either came from Italy, they spread out from northern Italy and France, and some of them from the Balkan region. So Iberian foxes are slightly unique amongst European foxes. And the other really funky group are actually in Scandinavia. And what we see in Scandinavia, which again had a very large ice sheet, is we see something called a suture zone. And this is where you've got different lineages coming from different regions and meeting. So we see it amongst a range of European mammals. In the case of European foxes, some came across Denmark. There was a land bridge across Denmark into Scandinavia. They came across that way. Some came the long route round via Russia and Finland. And so Scandinavia sees a mixture of both these Russian origin foxes and these Central European kind of Danish origin foxes. So Scandinavia shows this suture zone. So Europe is in itself a really complicated mix, really shaped by glacial periods. And again, to take this away, more broadly, the whole understanding of fox genetics has to be looked at in relation to the glacial periods. And of course, the other thing, as I said, is we've moved foxes around and in huge numbers. Leadenhall Market in London used to trade around about 100 to 150,000 live foxes a year, not dead foxes, live foxes a year. And this was because they were used as fox hunting. So foxes used to be quite uncommon in Britain, they were quite rare, and fox hunts still wanted their sport, so they bought them. So you all might be familiar with the term bag man. Well, these foxes were so expensive, they didn't hunt them to exhaustion to kill them. They caught them at the end of the day and brought them back into the kennels to keep. And the bag man was responsible for catching again and then bringing the fox back and then releasing it again when they wanted to hunt it. But foxes have been moved extensively, particularly from Europe to the UK. But actually, foxes from Britain were taken to Spain. I have no idea why. Foxes from Sweden were brought into the UK to improve fur quality. We exported them from the UK to Australasia and to the US, and the US to Europe. What I would say is there doesn't seem to be very good evidence of them surviving and breeding. So in North America, for example, there's been a lot of work to see whether there's been any movement of genes of invasive red foxes, and there's not a lot of evidence that they've taken hold. So it does seem that these foxes moved around, didn't survive very well. We certainly don't have any Swedish fox genes, and there's no evidence of American fox genes in Sweden, for example. They were imported there. So yeah, we moved them around an awful lot, but they don't seem to have taken, and they don't seem to have thrived. The movement of foxes was so extensive, and the people catching these foxes in Europe weren't brilliant at identifying them. It was well known that occasionally they accidentally let loose juvenile wolves into the British countryside by accident, because they were small dog-like things. They just, they were fine. So there was also the last introduction of rabies into this country was also via that same route, from brought in via this fox hunting process of bringing foxes in. So this has to a lesser extent shaped the genetics of foxes, but certainly part of that interaction with humans that's so important. So that's the first part of the talk. That's the first bit of the kind of global overview of the species. The next bit that I'm going to take you through until the break is a little bit about fox life. And this is a very generic romp through. This would apply to a fox in Europe versus a fox in Britain, even in Australia. Just change the dates for Australia because they have a different summer and winter. So this is what a fox year would generally look like. I started it with giving birth as day 0, with mating at the end. So fox cubs are generally born around about the latter half of March through to about the middle of April. The very last litters of cubs I would expect to be born now, but this would be quite late. The birth date and the mating date change with latitude. So it's earlier as you go further south. It would be earlier, for example, in Italy or Iberia. It's later as you go further north. Cubs tend to be born much later in April into May if you go into Scandinavia. And this is followed by a period of dependency. What I mean by dependency, this is where the cubs are reliant on their parents for nutrition. Initially milk, but also then for providing food. But there's also a spell in the summer, as we're going to show, where cubs are no longer dependent on their parents. They forage independently. They're still growing. They're still cubs. They roam around the territory, but they are no longer dependent on their parents for nutrition. And believe me, by that point, parents are fairly desperate for them to go. There's a really important period in winter called dispersal, where cubs leave their natal territories and move off. And there's a small window of mating in January and February. So let's look at this in more detail. We're going to start actually with mating. These are actually a couple of my study animals. So mating takes place in January. More specifically, it takes place in the latter half of January and early February. There's a window of about 2 weeks where the female is fertile. They have something known as a copulatory lock. Many canids have this. This is where the male's penis swells inside the female. They stay locked like this for about an hour, and it's part of a paternity assurance mechanism. So the male is ensuring that he sires the cub. As I'm going to show you later on, it doesn't work, but that's what it's evolved for. The female is largely in control of this process in the sense of if she wants to do something, the male follows, well, pretty meekly, to be honest, because he's held there by his genitals. His genitals have a large bone inside them called a baculum. And unfortunately for males, they break. They're quite fragile things. And a lot of that breakage actually comes because females are a bit impatient. And I feel very guilty about this even to this day, I have disturbed a mating pair in a garden before, and I've seen a female scramble over a 6-foot fence, dragging the male by his genitals. Very passively, I hasten to add. He didn't make a sound, he just looked very resigned to his fate. I feel very guilty for that male. So mating takes place in January, vixens give birth, and we used to say that all cubs were born around about April the 1st, but actually it's a 2-week window either side. And the cubs stay in the den for about the first 3, 4, 5 weeks. The first cubs usually emerge, depends on temperature, looking at the date, 22nd of April. Actually, the first cubs I usually get reported about 22nd of April, 23rd of April. So the early litters would be out and about. So those first period, they spend a lot of time in the territory with in their den with their mother. And she spends a lot of time very restricted in her movements. One of the reasons why they have to have a pair is because she's reliant on the male for food. He's a lovely father. He brings her food while she's keeping the cubs warm. And in fact, I've got some data which one day I'll get around to publishing. It shows that he actually changes his diet. What he does is he stops eating big food items and he brings them all to the female. He stops eating them, she starts eating them. So things like rabbits, large birds, for example, things that are easy to carry as a meal, he brings them to her during this period. By about April, mid-April time, she starts moving away from the den, not for long periods, and her movements are quite restricted, but she starts to spend more and more time moving away from the cubs. And to be honest, they're starting to get quite large. They start chewing her, their pains in the rear end. I'd want to spend time away from them as well. Although they live as a monogamous pair, there's still quite high competition for access to females, and the males will fight vigorously and will sometimes kill each other in competition for access. So that period in January and February is where most of the fighting occurs and also where most of the injury occurs. Most of those injuries are relatively minor, tend to be on the muzzle, sometimes more severe. They can rip each other's throat out. Foxes bite, hurt. They also go septic. They take a long time to heal, and that's a personal experience. So if they do get severe bites and puncture wounds, quite often they can be debilitating. They can take time to heal. They can break bones. I often get asked this question about rehabilitation of foxes with injuries. I personally would say nature take its course. Unless the animal is suffering, let nature take its course. I have seen my study animals have broken limbs and recover fine. And most foxes, when they die, have had some broken bone during their lifetime as part of their life in general. Most of those injuries will heal. Only if it was a true welfare incident, so either paralysis or a break that breaks the skin or something, would I ever condone intervention. I think that, you know, these are wild animals. That is part of their daily lives. During that period, when the mating season is occurring, there's often the largest amount of vocalizations. It always makes me laugh when I watch a detective program and they have a lovely nighttime scene and you hear a vixen screaming. Wow, wow, wow. It's the vixen screaming. She mainly screams in January. Whenever there's nighttime, there has to be either a tawny owl hooting or a vixen screaming. It's ridiculous. They should do their homework. The vixens are screaming, a long distance call to attract males in. The males also vocalize, but it's much softer. It's known as a woo 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 bark. And often you only hear it if you're quite close to them. It always reminds me of somebody applying the brakes to a bicycle going down a steep hill. Woo, 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 woo. Very soft, very quiet. And that's actually a much more close contact call. The males are actually not trying to advertise their presence. And that's because, I'm going to show you later on, the males sneak around trying to find females to mate with. They may be loving fathers, but that doesn't stop them coveting their neighbour's wife. These fights, as I say, are vigorous, and the larger the male, the more likely they are to be successful. And again, I'll show you some of that later on. The males will try and guard the female, so they'll try and follow them continuously, but let's be honest, it doesn't work. Genetically, it can be all over the place. A large male can usurp a smaller male if they come in contact, and the females are actively advertising, and they're advertising for other males to come in. Naughty girls. So cubs are initially fed milk throughout April. They start to be weaned towards the end of April into May, but they remain dependent on their parents for food items through to the end of June. So there's two key transition periods here. That first period from milk to food items, But actually the most important of these is that transition from being fed to looking for your own food. Essentially having the larder well stocked, your fridge full of food, and then learning having to go to the supermarket and work out what's edible. And that second period at the end of June is really vital for it shapes the entirety of fox lives, that point. Now, the parents are really nice. They bring them food items. And again, the cub diet is really filled with large food items, things like rabbits, things like birds. Even in urban areas where you'd think these are less common, they still bring large food items to their offspring. And it's not just the parents that help, particularly in urban areas where you may have helpers in those fox groups. Other helpers will also bring food items. And actually it's great. If you've got extra people feeding your cubs, it means you do less work. The parents actually come out of the breeding season in better condition when they've got helpers. It doesn't improve the cubs' growth. It doesn't particularly improve their survival, but the parents look a lot better. Believe me, by the time July comes round, those parents look pretty ropey. They look pretty knackered, as you would if you've got teenage offspring. You look pretty tired. So this second period is in July is when they become nutritionally independent. And that nutritional independence is associated with a change in diet. And it's quite a severe change in diet. So I'll show you in the next slide. That is actually one of my study species. It seemed to get quite friendly with this guy. Why on earth they have fake Iron Age forts in Bristol, I don't know, but they do. So this is what their diet looks like. You can see that in May and June, their diet is dominated by these large food items, large prey items such as birds and to a less extent mammals. But what happens in July, these small food items, earthworms, insects and things appear more commonly in the diet. And particularly earthworms shoots up dramatically. It makes a lot of sense. If you're going to try and catch bird prey, you need to be fairly skillful. If you're going to try and catch a mouse, you're going to have practice. It's hard to do. It requires skill. Whereas it doesn't really require skill to catch earthworms. It doesn't require skill to find insects. So they change their diet from these large food items through into these smaller, easy to find food items. But what it does mean is that their diet is very, very weather dependent, and particularly for earthworms. So where July is wet and there are lots of earthworms, they have lots of earthworms in their diet. They grow bigger, they grow fatter, and they grow faster. And ultimately their adult body size is determined by the amount of earthworms they eat. In fact, their adult body size is dependent on the amount of July rainfall. If there's a good Wimbledon with lots of sunshine, it's bad for foxes. If it's a really poor Wimbledon and lots of rain, it's good for foxes and they grow better. And it's very similar to the pattern you can see in badgers as well. They're very dependent on earthworms. So their whole life history, their whole growth and size is dependent on that rainfall just during that month. It's got nothing to do with June. It's got nothing to do with August. It's just July. I was asked by a textbook company a few years ago if I could provide some real data for them to include as part of a textbook. And as part of that, I actually dug out some data from 2 different years that were side by side during the 90s. And one was a really wet year. And I gave them the growth of the cubs every month. And in the wet year, it's linear. Every month they increase about 1 kilo a month. The dry year that followed, they stopped growing in July. For a whole month, all the fox cubs stayed the same size. They don't grow that 1 kilo. And then in August, they catch up again. They never recoup the lost time. They never catch up that whole kilo, but their growth starts to take off again in August. So just really emphasizing how important July is. Now that varies a little bit where you are in the country, because of course it depends on when the cubs are born. But where we were and where we were studying them, that July was the critical period. So when they're independent, foragers, they spend time moving around their parents' territory. Essentially, they're living at home, but not necessarily paying the rent. And what we find is that towards the end of this period, there's increase in hormones, things like testosterone, for example, and essentially they start growing in more and more conflict with their parents. Some of them will get kicked out, and this is known as a disperser. They leave their home territory, and what they do is they spend time exploring the surrounding area, looking for places to breed, basically a vacancy. Some, however, do stay. And the ratios for this are around about 60%, 70% of males leave, about 60 to 70% of the females stay. So it's very sex dependent. Females are more likely to stay. If females do leave, they tend to move next door into next territory. They tend to move very short distances. The real wandering sex, the one that moves the furthest, tends to be the males. Those movements can be very, very long. So in a straight line, they can move about 300 kilometers. In terms of the actual distance they move, absolute, can be thousands of kilometers. And so what it does mean is foxes can rapidly recolonize areas. If foxes are shot or culled, particularly in Australia, where they try to manage their populations for the benefit of wildlife, the rapidity in which they move back into an area is a real problem. They've got a very good homing instinct, so slightly unethical to do it these days, but in the past they've taken them different distances away, and they've been able to home back from points where they've been dropped off up to about 60 kilometers. So these animals can move really, really long distances. Now, during that winter period, through sort of October through to January time, back to the breeding, this is when most of the territories are being refilled. So foxes don't live a long time. Most foxes only live 12 months. If they can survive to be an adult, their average lifespan is about 3 years. So they're a relatively short-lived species. So there's always vacancies to find. And so part of those movements is to find and locate those vacancies. And it's very, very rapid. If an adult male were to die, I would expect it to probably be recolonized by another fox in 2 or 3 days, really rapidly. They do this because they have a bookkeeping process of laying scent marks around their territory. And those scent marks have to be replenished. And as soon as those scent marks are not replenished, a fox knows there's a vacancy, and in they go. And I had some undergraduates many years ago actually do some experiments where they pretended to be foxes, and they basically went round the streets sprinkling fake urine around hundreds of times, pretending to be an intruding fox. They didn't enjoy it. It was good work, actually. Some good results, but I think they got some really dirty looks from people, especially when you're walking around with like a litre bottle of fox urine, as you do. So what do foxes eat? And I think the real thing I can say here is, what do foxes not eat? If they can swallow it, they'll eat it. If they can try it, they will. And of course, that does lead them to try things that will kill them. They can eat things that are poisonous. There's even cases of foxes dying of chocolate poisoning in Europe. Believe it or not, the foxes were eating the chocolate from the outflow of a chocolate factory. Chocolate's poisonous, in case you don't know, to many animals. Well, these foxes died from eating chocolate from a chocolate factory. Yeah, basically they'll eat anything. And so their diet is very seasonal dependent. They take advantage of what food they can find. If there's an abundance of fruit, their diet is dominated by fruit. If there's lots of small mammals, they'll eat that. If you're putting scraps out, they'll eat that. They'll eat birdseed. To be honest, what haven't I seen in a fox stomach is a shorter list by comparison. As I say, they do die from their greediness. Foxes have nearly killed me because of their diet. So I went to collect a dead fox once that I was reported. It died with its head in a pond. So literally its face was in the water. The rest of its body was outside. I went there to collect this dead fox, and this householder was fairly adamant that foxes had been poisoned. I wasn't sure. He pointed out that in the pond there were also dead frogs. That's true. There were floating frogs everywhere. Oh, this is serious. Better take a sample of the frogs with me as well to send away for analysis. I stuck my hand into the pond to collect a frog, and the guy's fish pump had short-circuited. And so I got kicked across the garden by an electric shock that had clearly killed the fox as well. It obviously thought its luck was in. Dead frogs, yummy, yummy, yummy. Stuck its face in, electrocuted. So I survived it. It didn't. But yeah, they're opportunists first and foremost. They will eat anything. yeah, everything in this image, including some of these weird tropical fruits, I have found in fox stomachs in Bristol. But if you go around the world, their diet is entirely dominated with what's available at the time. So if you go to Africa, there isn't large numbers of mammals, there aren't large numbers of birds. Their diet is heavily biased towards things like insects and fruit. Italy, large numbers of small mammals. Poland, loads of mammals. And that's partially because they've also got, you can watch it later, don't worry. In Poland, they've got large numbers of small rodents, but they've also got carrion as well. So they take advantage of any carrion from large carnivores that's available. As I say, they will eat anything, and even it will vary seasonally. So you could imagine that fruit, things like bramble, things like apples are more common in autumn. If you look at their seasonal diet, 25% of their diet in autumn time is made up by fruit. Earthworms year round. Earthworms are more common in summer when the earthworms come to the surface, when it's warm and moist. Essentially, they will make use of anything. And of course, their diet will switch if there are population cycles of food. So in Poland in particular, this is data from Białowieża forest, you can see that the rodent populations undergo a cycle, peaks and troughs. Where there are less rodents, they eat less of them. They will often substitute, as I say, by having more birds or having more or carrion in their diet. Basically, these things will eat anything. So I'm going to show you a video. So often I like at this point just to highlight that foxes often eat small food items. It's not because I want to do them a disservice, but really that's what's easy. Foxes, don't get me wrong, are lazy. They eat things that they can find easily, quickly and easily. They're opportunists, but they are predators. So bear with me. So I normally have a much longer video, but I couldn't get it to play on my home PC. So I'm going to show you a brief one. But it just emphasizes that they are actually predators. It's only 14 seconds. You should be able to see it on full screen. So if you see down here, this is a red fox in Australia in a camera trap, and you can see it's caught and killed a wallaby. And that wallaby is the same size, if not bigger. I know it's a short video. The other image I've got is actually of a kind of struggle of a wallaby, but they are predators. So don't get me wrong. You know, I love foxes to bits, but don't forget that they will take larger prey if the opportunity arises. Okay. So they're successful because they will try everything. So emphasizing that they are opportunistic. That's one reason why they're found in all those different habitats around the world. It's because they can make use of the resources in a way that many other animals can't do it. They will have a go, and they are persistent. They're not afraid of larger predators as well. So I've seen them taunt large predators. That vulture is potentially dangerous to the fox. Normally there's a sequence of pictures. That fox will win. It will keep coming back. So, last few slides before the break, I want to focus a little bit on urban foxes. Why do I focus on urban foxes? Is because, by gum, there are so many urban myths about urban foxes, it drives me slightly potty. And to say that foxes rifle their way through bins, eating leftovers, makes me furious, because they don't. Now, if you're silly enough to spill your chips on the floor, they'll eat them. If you spill your takeaway on the floor, they'll eat them. But they are opportunistic. They will take whatever's there. In reality, most of their diet in urban areas is given to them, either directly by people and householders putting scavenged food out. These can be chicken bones, they can be lumps of meats, leftover stuff, all that kind of, anything, essentially. You can see that it can be bread. Scavenged items will include bread put out for birds. They'll eat bird seed. They'll eat wild birds and mammals, fruit. Actually, when you look at it, very, very few people had their rubbish rifled. And this is in the olden days when people put bin bags out. In Bristol, they had wheelie bins for a long time, and it made no difference to fox diet, and it made no difference to the condition of the urban foxes. So again, when you hear anybody say that urban foxes are starving runts, I've had foxes die from what I think were probably obesity. They were so bloody fat. So it's not true. London was slightly different because they had left the culture of feeding foxes. But you can still see that a large proportion of those foxes are being deliberately fed. About 30% of the diet of foxes in urban areas was given to them directly. They just switched to what's available. So don't think that urban foxes are dependent on us for our resources. To put it in context, one of the projects that I was involved in went out and measured how much energy was in the environment that a fox could access. So this could be things like invertebrates, small mammals, birds, fruit. We did the whole ecosystem, and we worked out that there was 60 to 90 times more food available in the environment than a fox needed. We could have supported densities of foxes that were astronomical. Essentially, there was just a glut of food in urban areas. Way too much for them to ever make use of. So just to emphasize, they're incredibly adaptable in urban areas. They are not bin rakers. Now, I have a pet hatred of a number of very famous photographers. Chris Packham is one of them. Chris Packham is a visiting professor at the University of Lincoln. I actually quite like him as a person. However, I have seen him stage these photographs and it annoys the hell out of me. This is actually where they've cut a hole in a bin, scattered some rubbish, and the fox has come along and gone, why is there a man in the bin? This is not because he's scattered the rubbish. This is just simply, it's a staged photograph. But these are the kind of staged photographs that always get trotted out and put into the media. It makes me slightly upset. It's a perception thing. Again, the other thing that happens quite a lot with urban foxes is where you've got an article, they trot out pest controller people as experts of urban foxes. Now, I've actually given talks at pest controller conferences. The last one I gave was great. They gave me a gift for doing the talk. The gift was a knife for the kitchen that was impossibly sharp. I chopped the end of my finger off the very first time I used it. It was also the only presentation I've ever given where there were crossbows and other killing devices down the side of the conference hall. These guys make money by creating a problem. Let me tell you, they're nice to talk to, but they're like, yeah, if we tell the householders there are problems, we're more likely to have them employ us so we can shoot foxes. So it's a bit like asking, well, asking the gamekeeper about a problem with their pheasants. It's one perception, and they deliberately big up a problem that isn't actually there. So please do take a pinch of salt when you read stuff in the media. It drives me slightly potty. Urban foxes, incredibly successful, and one of the other things they are really successful in doing is making us feed them. So many of our householders used to put out food with them, used to treat them basically as wild pets. And people believe that these foxes lived just in their garden. These foxes would go from household to household and household on a rota, and people would feed them. And when I mean a rota, they had their time slot. I've gone to people's houses at the allotted time, and the fox would be there. These animals were smarter than us, let me tell you. They really had us, they were manipulating human behavior. So yes, don't think urban foxes are any way scrawny or underfed. They've got us on the ropes. So this is a good time for a break. I move on. So we've talked a little bit about foxes, their life cycle, their diet. What about their social life? How do foxes live? So a typical basic unit for a fox group would be a dominant male and a dominant female. They live as a monogamous pair. And that would be the same as if they're living in desert regions or the Arctic regions or even an urban environment. What does vary, depending on the location, is the number of subordinates that live in a group. Now, generally, these tend to be subordinate females. Often they're offspring from previous years, and they stay on the territory and help. But where there's particularly high densities, there may also be subordinate males that join the group. Now, most of the time, these are related, but sometimes at really high densities in Bristol, we found unrelated males would join other groups as subordinates as well. So these are actually quite complicated. I'm talking about a group, not a pack. And so the key difference here is that packs perform cooperative behaviours such as cooperative hunting. Foxes are actually solitary foragers. Just because you see two foxes together, they're social animals, they'll greet each other, they'll play, they have dominance, subordinate hierarchies, and you'll see dominance and submissive behaviours. But actually, they are a group, not a pack. And there was a lovely story that, again, many years ago, of this Glaswegian taxi driver who was accosted by a pack of snarling foxes on a golf course. He fought off with a golf club, and it was fairly heroic. But the fact was that, firstly, Glaswegian taxi driver, that must have been something pretty scary to frighten him. And yeah, he might have seen a group of foxes together. Cubs sometimes will go around 2 or 3 at a time, but these are not packs. These are social animals, so they can be seen more than one, but they are solitary foragers. And so most of the fox's life, much of the time I'd be out following them at night with radio transmitters. I never saw another fox. Sometimes I saw foxes other ends of the street. Sometimes I even saw them with another fox in a garden or socializing. But a lot of the time, the foxes was moving around the territory on its own. So it's a fox group, not a pack. As I say, the additional group members are usually females, and quite typically they're subordinate cubs from previous years. Now, for a long time, we thought these subordinate females couldn't reproduce. We thought they were suppressed by the dominant female. But with work and with genetic evidence, we've shown that quite often these subordinate females actually do reproduce. And what can happen is sometimes that they pool litters together. So you get litters that are a combination of other females and the dominant female, kind of super large ones. I've seen 10, 11, 12 in a kind of super combined litter. If you live in an urban area and you've got a litter of 10, 11, 12 cubs playing in your garden, you will not have much garden left. You won't have many flowers, that's for certain. They're puppies, they play, they chew, they trample, they poo, they smell, they pee. They can be quite destructive. I'm not going to deny that. But certainly by pooling the litters as well, that's, again, a labour-saving activity. One adult can babysit all of those cubs. You don't need 2 females. It's pooling them together to make sure that there's pooling resources to one single location. So there's a lot of benefits to group life. So this is actually some radio tracking data that I collected during my PhD in Bristol. The blue circles represent male foxes, the yellow circles represent female foxes, and the labels represent the tag numbers of those individuals at the time. And what you can see is that, firstly, there's not really any space. There are places and there are gaps that you can see, and if there are spaces and gaps, that's usually because I haven't caught the fox that lives there. It's imprecise science. I can't catch every single one. You'll see that sometimes it's just yellow circles on their own and no blue. I didn't catch the male, so it's just the female. Notice how closely the male and female territories overlap. The male territories tend to be slightly larger than the females, but you can see that they overlap very closely with each other. There are boundary areas, so you can see there are overlaps between neighbouring groups, but actually those overlap areas are often minimally used. So quite often they're only used for, say, 10 to say even 15% of the time. And most of the other activities are in the core areas, are away from those territory boundaries. And sometimes those territory boundaries are using linear features. So it could be the edge of, in this case, the Bristol Downs. Sometimes it could be major roads, for example, act as boundaries. Good question. I missed that in the chat. If the subordinates can breed, what characteristics make the dominant female dominant? Simply from her behaviours. So she'll get priority access to resources. The subordinates will show subordinate affiliated behaviour. They'll often roll on their back. They'll often lick the muzzle, for example. So they're demonstrating behaviours which show that dynamic. It's probable that the females as well may get some advantage by being a dominant. Their cubs might be born earlier, so their cubs are larger. And therefore more likely to compete for access to food. So there are a whole host of benefits to being a dominant. The other thing I want to show you in this image is where we've got groups of individuals. So in the center, you might see this female 3193 the male 3318 and 3315. That's actually a mum, a father, and an offspring. And so again, you can see that the entire group have got the same range and the same range shape, for example. So most of these animals here, that actually a good bunch of them have names associated with them. I know them well. There is a relationship with the size of the male and the size of the territories. So some of the smallest males in there, for example, 3290 was a tiny male. He has the smallest territory. So the males make use of their body size to squeeze out those smaller males. Each one of these home ranges here, these territories, they took about 6 nights worth of radio tracking to collect. We used to start our radio tracking at 8 p.m. God, 8 a.m. I wish. 8 p.m. and we'd finish at 4 a.m. So you can work out from all those different circles how many nights of radio tracking, how many sleepless nights was taken to generate those data. The answer is a lot. And I have to say, I look back on it with incredible rose-tinted glasses. I look back at it and go, don't I remember that time the fox did this? Wasn't it lovely? There was beautiful moon. Doing it was actually really hard. Let's be honest. When doing it, I really didn't enjoy it at times. It really screws up your sleep pattern. So there is great flexibility in the fox territories and the great flexibility in group sizes. Smallest fox territories in those urban areas, they're really talking a handful of hectares in size, through to the really big ones in say, desert or tundra regions. And similarly is that flexibility. And in those unproductive habitats, you're talking usually pairs, a dominant male, dominant female, but you can have group sizes up to 6 to 7 in urban areas. So again, that flexibility which characterizes foxes across all of their things is also found in their social grouping. And I say, take nothing away, these are groups, they're not packs. Not packs, not packs. They don't hunt as a pack. So as I say, for a long time, we thought that it was just the dominant individuals that bred. But actually, with genetic evidence, we've shown that it's actually a mixture of dominant and subordinate females. And actually, in really high density populations, some of the subordinate males also gain access to reproduction. Now, this is a genetic mating system, not the social mating system. The social mating system is built really around this monogamous pair. But genetically, it's a lot more complicated. It's a lot closer to a polygynous system. So what the males do during the breeding season is essentially go for a wander. So these are actually the core areas of male territory. So these are where they spend most of their activity. And you can see from the colours that the males during the breeding season would go for a wander. And they would cross maybe 2 or 3 other territories, all looking for access to a reproductive event with another female, a neighbouring female. The blue male, he was a male called Trinity. In fact, I was going to say I've got his skull sitting here. I've got his skull somewhere in my office. He was a very large male, and he used to wander all over the place. This is just that limited period when females are reproductively active. He actually would, 3 or 4 territories away was quite, and they moved very quickly, trying to access females. So that long distance signaling, that long distance call is one way in which the females can attract the males. The male in the middle with a light green circle, he was a small male. He's about 5.7, 5.8 kilos, called Coat Park, named after where he lived. He lost paternity of the entirety of his litter. He remained a faithful father. He raised those cubs the following year, but they were genetically not his. They actually belongs to a neighbouring male. So it does show that there seems to be some limited, some inability for them to have recognition of their offspring if they're not genetically related. Trinity was great. I actually remember the movement where he appeared in that black male's territory. I was up there actually radio tracking radio tracking a female who used to live out there on the golf course. And it was a beautiful frosty night. This is that rose-tinted moment, I hasten to add. Beautiful frosty evening. He appeared just out of nowhere. I wasn't looking for him, but he was so close, he was actually interfering with the radio transmitter I had in my hand. The signal was coming through. And he was walking lovely, beautifully bushy-tailed across the fairways, and I actually rolled. I had golf balls that I found on the golf course in the middle of the night, and I actually rolled a golf ball along the fairway, and he chased after it like a little puppy. Oh, wasn't it idyllic? Yeah, that's that rose-tinted pattern. I'm sorry. It was actually really cold, I hasten to add. So what can happen is that males can sire multiple litters, and actually multiple males can actually sire multiple cubs within the same litter. In really high densities, up to 4 different fathers have been found in one single litter. What we found when the densities were slightly lower is actually there was a bit more mixed, and actually the males tended to sire the entirety of the litter. But at high densities, there was often this thing called multiple paternity. And if you look at the relationship in terms of number of litters being sired and the size, you can see that the bigger males, those that are sitting there at over 6.5 kilos, typically sired 2 or even 3 litters of cubs in any one breeding season. So these bigger males were gaining some competitive advantage. And if you think back to the start when I talked about fighting, those bigger males are likely to win those contests if there's any kind of competitive interaction. So a bit more about urban foxes. So we've often think of urban foxes being a British phenomenon, even a British problem, but in reality, urban foxes are found pretty much everywhere. They were actually first recorded in urban areas in Australia rather than in Britain. One key limitation for urban foxes tends to be competing carnivore populations, and particularly stray dog populations. And what we find is that where there are high densities of stray dogs, you don't get urban foxes moving into those areas. And in North America, that competing carnivore includes things such as coyotes. So, urban coyotes will kill and will displace the smaller red fox. But essentially, you'll find urban foxes pretty much across the distribution, and they're probably under-recorded in some locations. They are a truly global phenomenon. Now, a bit more myth busting, because I've got to love those, is why did they move into British cities? Lack of food? No, loads of food. Notice now that the lack of food was a reason for them to come into urban areas, allegedly, and now there's no food in urban areas, so say some people. No, there was plenty of food in urban areas. It was not caused by the rabbit population crashing from myxomatosis, and it certainly wasn't overcrowding in rural areas because urban fox densities are way higher than they are in rural areas. Essentially, they moved into urban areas because there was a vacant ecological niche. So in Britain, they started to colonize in the late 1930s, and that was characterized by that expansion of those 1930s suburbs, that low density housing with lots of big gardens. They do well where there's nice garden spaces. Why? Well, they're protected, places to breed, lots of food. To be honest, it's just an absolute invite for foxes to move into those areas. They were recorded in central London, right in the centre in the 1960s. They've been recorded in many cities, and actually they were largely absent from some of the smaller industrial towns in the north and in Wales, but actually more recent surveys have shown that they are colonising those and have quite large populations. I see no reason why most cities now shouldn't house urban fox populations. I guess one key limitation is that they've got to come from the rural population. So around Lincoln, for example, it's taken a while for urban foxes to take hold. That's partially because the density of rural foxes is so low from all the gamekeepers, but they have now colonized and are starting to expand. So they are making use of an environment. They're commonest where you've got that low density housing. So with big gardens, 1930s semi-detached is ideal for them. Loads of places for food, loads of places to breed. They'll breed underneath sheds. They'll also even breed underneath floorboards if given the opportunity. And of course, need to have somewhere to rest. They don't have one fixed den site. They have a number of resting sites spread around their territory. Sometimes they like them a lot. I had a dispersing fox that I went to which was with a radio collar. It was in the same location 3-4 nights in a row, and it never moved during the night. I went there to go and collect his dead body. Turns out it was underneath a compost. When I stuck my head under that compost, it wasn't a dead body. It was a really peed off fox. It just really liked that resting site. It really liked that compost heap for whatever reason. So they will use some sites more than others, but they have range of different locations. This is not uncommon for them to be sleeping on top of sheds or on top of buildings. And as I mentioned as well, the stray dog distribution is important. So this is the stray dog distribution in the early 1980s. This is the fox distribution. And you can see that they're inversely related. Where the stray dogs were commonest was not where you found foxes. And then certainly in many European cities that still have stray dogs or have populations of dogs which are kind of free roaming, they probably do place a limit to urban foxes. Now, interestingly, I gave a talk a few weeks ago to the Slovenian Huntians Association, and we talked a little bit actually about, I was talking about urban wildlife in general. We talked a little bit about golden jackals in Europe, and there's a species which has the potential to compete, at least ecologically, probably certainly impact fox populations if they start moving into urban areas. And that's a species that's spreading through Europe. It's been recorded into France now. And so I think actually we may see some changing dynamic of European fox populations because of the change in golden jackals. So another myth buster is, are urban foxes increasing? And these are quotes taken again by our good buddies, the pest controllers. And Peter Crowden, one of the guys who I spoke with, who gave me the knife actually, you are asking the wrong people here. Are there more foxes than there have been? Well, the answer really is yes and no. It depends really where you are. It depends on the city, and it depends about the local population dynamics. In Bristol, where I worked, there was a disease outbreak in the mid-90s, and the population crashed nearly to zero. And it took a long time for the population to recover, nearly 25 years. So if you looked at the population, say, in the mid-2000s, it was increasing in Bristol. And the reason it was increasing is because it was rebounding from a disease outbreak. In other places, the populations will be stable. In other places, the populations may even be declining. There is a long-term evidence from the Garden Mammal Survey that fox populations seem to be declining. But it's a lot more complicated. So I would never say yes or yes to one specific location. It really depends on the urban area and the population dynamics and the history of that fox population ultimately. So it depends on where you live. And where I lived, where I was working, it took, to say, the populations 20 to 25 years to approach the same densities from the 90s. So it really is dependent, and it's often dependent on the local perception. And so the question we had earlier about there being lots of mangy, ill foxes, it depends. Foxes can be rare, hard to see in an urban area. They can be incredibly visible. And all of those things plug into the local perception of what the fox population is doing ultimately. And I certainly, and behaviour is part of that. I can certainly recall foxes that were very hard to see, even with a radio transmitter. They were very hard and very cryptic, versus other ones that would brazenly out in the open. Indeed, I had foxes that were go-tos. If somebody said, I want to film an urban fox, I knew which fox to go to because of their confidence around people. So again, it's that local population, and that changes with time. Now, another question is, are urban foxes different from rural foxes? And so there's been some evidence in Europe, at least, that there's some genetic separation between urban and rural foxes. And that possibly reflects a kind of gene flow of harder for foxes to move into high densities than it is for them to move into low densities. And as I say, urban areas are high density. So there's certainly some likelihood that it's harder for some kind of gene flow. But certainly from movement and tagging studies, we know that urban foxes are the same as rural foxes. And urban foxes can leave those rural foxes, those urban areas, and travel out into the countryside. So this is actually some GPS data from a fox tagged in Brighton. And as you can see, it had a lovely holiday wandering around the South Downs before its GPS collar failed. In Bristol, for example, there were tagging results of foxes tagged as cubs being shot on the Mendip Hills as adults. It's like 20, 30 kilometres south of Bristol. So there's no clear separation between them. We have radio tracking data in Bristol of foxes regularly swimming across the River Avon and crossing to move into the countryside. Sometimes they swim the River Avon when the River Avon was flooded. And those foxes didn't necessarily make a straight transit across the River Avon. It was kind of a into the water, and then a few kilometres further south, they got out the other side, just showing that they can be a bit silly sometimes. But certainly they're not different. There is no boundary, and there is movement, certainly of individuals out of the urban areas. And at the peripheral area, there'll be movement of foxes into those areas. The foxes in Lincoln, for example, they moved into the urban area from the rural countryside. They didn't come from anywhere else. They weren't brought here. They're not an urban subspecies. They moved in from the rural area. So what about problems posed by urban foxes? So attacks on people do occur. They are very rare. To put it in context, you're more likely to be bitten by a human than you are to be bitten by a fox. And that probably isn't any great surprise, actually. It can be caused by people deliberately feeding foxes and encouraging them to houses. Foxes are naturally curious. And there is a tendency of young foxes getting themselves into trouble, particularly younger, that kind of teenage years. They tend to go into houses or things. Foxes will steal objects as well. The fox dens are a real mine of fantastic toys that the foxes would steal. I had my favourite Rocky and Bullwinkle that I retrieved from a fox den once that my wife has thrown out and I'm deeply upset about. But they would take balls, shoes, gardening gloves, cuddly toys that dogs have. They'll nick those. What I would say is they are wild animals. And just because you like the wild animal, and perhaps you like to hand feed it, there'll be people who are petrified of foxes. And the fact even a fox walks across their driveway is terrifying to them. It might be hard for you to believe, but we need to keep that boundary between them and humans. Not so much for the... Hello, can I help you? Mm-hmm. Not so much for the for our benefit, but actually for the fox's benefit, so that they don't put themselves or be placed in risk. And I'd say that was often a common problem, as people were just simply afraid of a fox that was pretty confident and blasé about humans. Actual quantitative data on fox attacks is incredibly rare. I know there's a paper that my former supervisor Steve Harris has put out recently, where they looked at whether foxes were attracted to the sounds of a baby crying. I did actually once find a paper on animal attacks in the UK which had a fox attack in it. Now, this was a 3-month period in Aberdeen. These were animal bites. Bites, I should hasten to add. 3/4 of those bites were from dogs, no great surprise. 13% of those hospitalized bites were humans. Ew, disgusting. 8%, 7.5% was from cats, 2.2% from hamsters, and then for the remaining handful of horse, rabbit, squirrel, pig, field mouse, which I presume is actually a wood mouse, and fox, was 0.75% each. So to put it in context, your risks of being bitten and hospitalized were far greater with hamsters versus a fox. So these are rare events. Now, I have been bitten by a fox. It hurts. These animals, if cornered and defending themselves, are going to do a lot of damage. So this is not something to undertake lightly, but I'm just placing it in the context of risks. This is a very, very, very unlikely rare event, and it's very upsetting and shocking when it actually does happen, but it is a rare event. Now, of course, they can predate and injure pets. They can carry diseases, and people hit them with cars. Sometimes, sadly, they hit them with cars deliberately, and I have seen that happen. So there are financial costs with urban foxes, but it's quite difficult to quantify. In reality, it's easy to put a number on something that costs money. It's harder to quantify the benefits. I would love to have foxes in my garden. I would gain pleasure from doing so. How do you put a number on the pleasure of observing a wild animal? And a lot of people do, because they put food out for them. So easy to find a cost, hard to find a benefit, and to bring those two things together. What I would say is we need to put all of these things in context. So our urban areas where we studied foxes at the time, they had a density of cats of about 300. Yes, that is not a typo. 300 cats per square kilometre. That is a lot of cats. Just imagine the pressure from those cats on small mammals and birds. It's extreme. To put it in context, there are about 5 to 15 foxes in the study site when I was studying it per square kilometre. So a handful of foxes. I've seen fox-cat interaction a number of times. They've always been of the cat either chasing the fox or the cat just not giving up monkey's rat's ass the fox. I'm not saying that foxes can't kill cats, and I certainly had people ring up and shout at me and scream and be very upset, but it's a rare event. Cats are more likely to be run over than they are to be killed by a fox, and quite often those cats that are killed tend to be either very young, so in the kitten stage, or vulnerable through old age or health conditions. We could say that really cats should be indoors, but in reality their risks posed to them are much higher of being run over. If we put that in context for another system, in North America they had a study where they radio-collared cats, and in a 1 4-week period 25% of their cats were killed by coyotes. That to me is a real human wildlife conflict problem. Our problem is not really there. I guess we're a bit sensitive to human wildlife conflict if we think that there's a real problem there. But yes, they will kill cats. They can kill cats. It certainly does occur. But the frequency of doing so is really, really tiny. They could make a very healthy living if they wanted to eat cats, take my word for it, but they don't. Cats are full of teeth and claws, and to be honest, they're not very nice to grab hold of. I've been there. And most of the other losses are caused by inadequate housing. We have to place this into context. It's a predator. Foxes will kill live prey. It's an opportunistic. It will take advantage if you're sloppy with your pet's housing. If you don't close the hutch at night, it will go in and it will eat the chickens. I had a lady who had a lovely house and she had free-range chickens in the middle of a fox territory, and those chickens were there for nearly 18 months. Not a problem. One day the fox went, holy, there's food, and had all of the chickens in one night. Took a lot of them. She then actually bought a very expensive chicken coop, but it was a chicken coop that wasn't secured. It had a very simple latch, just a little latch like that. And the fox banged the door one night, latch sprung open, and it had the chickens again. That is not the fox's fault. Make sure you have secured your pets, you have secured whatever you're trying to look after properly. You know, fox is opportunistic. It can go through that garden 100 times, and it's that one time it just needs that bit of luck, and your pets have been killed. So investing in being in secure accommodation and looking after that is really the best way for us. They're opportunistics, 100%. Now, this is usually the point someone asks a question about, why do foxes kill all of the chickens? Why does it take just one? I don't see anyone nodding in the images, but I'm sure it's in there in the back of your head. It's very common for many predators to kill far more prey than they need. It's quite often a consequence of them coming across a superabundance of prey all at once. So it happens with livestock, but it's also happened in the wild, where animals have come across a herd that's stunned by, say, thunder and lightning and are frightened and not running away, and they will kill them all. Animals take advantage of superabundance of resources, and if given the opportunity, the fox would cache that food for a later date. In reality, what comes out is someone runs outside and scares the fox away. Well, it's not coming back, it's not stupid. But they would, in a natural scenario, store that food and cache it and use it as a resource in times of hardship. So this is something that's not just fox specific, it's something that's found in many other carnivores. So what about diseases? So foxes can carry a whole host of parasitic diseases, including some which are important for pets and also very important for humans. The one that perhaps concerns me most is this parasite called Echinococcus multilocularis. It's a parasite that is thankfully not found in the UK. It's one of those parasites that we have to worm our dogs with if you've got a pet passport, but it is widespread on the continent, and it can cause really long-term health issues if humans are infected with it. It does require a cycle involving small mammals, But small mammals and other carnivores, including domestic cats, can keep it cycling in an urban area, and people suffer debilitating ailments if they contract it, and it costs a lot of money to try and clear up. So it's a scary disease, and that's what our biosecurity is, to try and prevent. We obviously don't have rabies, but again, that's a problem. Foxes are a really important vector for rabies in other countries. So the main threat to humans, to emphasize though, is not from the fox itself, but from our domestic animals. But foxes harbor those diseases and can transmit them to our pets. And they can transmit them directly to us, but rarely. It's more likely they pass them to our pets than pass them on to us. So what can we do about urban foxes? Quite often I get asked about urban fox control, and essentially it's pointless. MAF, so Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Health, and I don't know what the F stands for. They started fox control in London for a long time. They had programs of shooting and culling at dens, and shooting and killing foxes and gassing cubs in dens. But essentially they relinquished control because it became too costly. And so by the 1980s, most local authorities had stopped, and in reality, it hadn't changed the spread of the urban foxes in the London area. And globally, very, very few cities have fox control, and most have now stopped. And one reason is just not economically viable. So colleagues up at York University have calculated the costs it takes to actually make an impact on the population, and the cost of setting traps and monitoring them. And essentially, it would require a density of 50 to 80 foxes per square kilometre. These are densities of foxes that have never been recorded anywhere. Even at the highest densities that we had in Bristol, they were never that high. So fox control, if undertaken, is a costly enterprise. And so that's why so few cities. That isn't to say that fox control can't be carried out at a local level, perhaps removing a problematic animal. It's entirely up to the householder. But at a proper city-wide level, it's never going to make an impact. Back in the 80s, they used to actually catch foxes for fur in British cities because there was still a market for fur. And even with the kind of catching for fur purposes, it didn't really make an impact on the fox population. It might be slightly lower. That's my dog now coming in, and slightly lower than it could, but ultimately it didn't really stop them from spreading. Now, I'm going to talk briefly about sarcoptic mange, because this is often the one that people talk about in terms of mangy foxes. So this is a widespread parasitic skin disease caused by a mite that burrows into the skin, and it's a mammal generic disease. And it causes disease outbreaks in loads of different animals. And so in wombats, for example, that's the image in the bottom left. It is a threat to their populations. Humans can contract it. It is actually an STD, believe it or not, which is ugh. It seems to be very common in canids and has caused fox outbreaks and disease outbreaks around the world. And so Britain's had one. There's been one in Scandinavia. There's been some in Iberia, for example. The mange mite lives in the skin. It burrows through and creates tunnels, and it lives and deposits eggs and feces in the skin. And quite often, it's obviously intensely itchy. Animals will bite their hindquarters. There's fur loss. There can be secondary allergic responses and necrosis, and animals will die of it. There's a distinctive thickening of the skin in the latter stages of infection. It often reminds me of kind of a thick, dried, cracked mud as the skin becomes thickened. And there's a very distinctive smell of a mangy fox, which turns my stomach. It's one of the few things I really find repulsive. I've obviously handled far too many foxes with this disease, and have died from this disease. That smell just lives with me. It is transmissible to other animals, mainly dogs, but that actually transmission is relatively rare. If an allergic response or secondary infections don't kill the animal, they can also waste away. They catabolize their muscles, and so large animals, let's say 6 or 7 kilos, they'll die at 3 or 4 kilos. That's not because they're starving. Of all the foxes I've necropsied that have had mange, most of them, in fact the vast majority of them, their stomachs are packed full of food, absolutely jam-packed. And it seems that they're just not able to get enough nutrition into their body to support the huge high densities of mites living on their skin. So it's not that they can't get food, they can't find food, they just can't get enough food into them, and it leads to their death. It is a progressive disease, and when it is first introduced into the population, it's nearly inevitably fatal. In the case of Bristol, when it was introduced, a single fox brought it to the population. In the first 14 months, the disease spread across the entirety of Bristol, and it wiped out pretty much 99% of the foxes, almost a scorched earth. The last few foxes that remained, I think the last 2 foxes that remained, were actually run over by cars. Subsequently, the disease has changed, and what we tend to find is that it affects juvenile individuals more. So juveniles are growing, they've not got so much resources into their immune system, and so they seem to be more susceptible and more at risk of dying. Adults can still die from it, but actually a good proportion of them can fight it off. They can look pretty rancid and pretty skanky with bare bums and things, but a good proportion of them will recover. And that's without active treatment. So this is a disease that still kills a large number of foxes. It is not an urban disease, so this partially relates a little bit to the question that was during the break. It's recorded all over the UK. It's seen more frequently in the urban areas, but it's seen more because there are firstly more foxes, there are more people, and in particular, mangy foxes tend to be susceptible to cold and actually tend to be out more during the daytime. It changes their behaviour as well. So the actual prevalence of the disease is no higher, but there is a visual perception that it's more common in urban areas, and it's just not supported. This is a disease that was actually brought into Bristol from the countryside. And when we looked at the spread, it seemed to be spreading across the south coast. It was first recorded in the early 80s in London. It seemed to spread across the south coast. And in Bristol, it appeared in one subordinate male in 1994, in the winter of 1993 to 1994, and then rampaged right across the city. So this is a disease that spreads equally well. Mange outbreaks in other countries, for example, have occurred in Scandinavia. Scandinavia doesn't have cities. It's spread across the entirety of the peninsula in a handful of years. This is a disease that really doesn't have any respect for urban or rural countryside. Oh, this is mangled this slide. I apologise. This is the bonus of having it converted to a PDF than a PowerPoint. All I want to say is that actually the chance of you catching mange, your dog catching mange, is pretty rare. We did find that there was an increase in prevalence in dogs associated with the disease outbreak, but not subsequently. And it's actually, if caught early, is really relatively a minor disease. This is more of a problem if you've got stray dogs. It is a debilitating disease, will kill them. But for most pets, this is relatively treatable. What I did find many years ago when I worked in a vet is that quite often the default go-to for any kind of skin irritation was either flea bite dermatitis or sarcoptic mange. In reality, you need to take a skin sample and actually have diagnosis of the mites in the skin to properly diagnose the sarcoptic mange. Sometimes, there was not that rigorous diagnosis, I hasten to add. So it is a rare disease for dogs to catch, but it can. Now, it takes a long time for the fox populations to recover. Now, we thought actually it would be relatively quick in an urban area. In reality, it took a long time, nearly 20 plus years. And this is actually consistent irrespective of where the populations have been. So in Scandinavia, it took 20 plus years for the disease the population to recover. So it seems this is a fairly consistent pattern. It's not a quick response, not a quick rebound, a long time for the populations to recover, so 20 plus years. So last little bit about man and foxes. This is a little bit about what we think of them and how we interact with them. Well, we've used them as a resource for a long time. We've used their fur for clothing. We've used them as food. We know from butchering marks that we used to eat them. And obviously more recently, we have them as both a pest and we use them as sport. I mentioned the piebald foxes. These are piebald foxes from a long-term study of domestication. And what they set out to do was try and domesticate foxes. And as a side effect of domestication, they actually showed this coloration that makes them look like little border collies, for example. To be honest, they may be cute, but foxes smell. They don't make the greatest of pets because, to be honest, they smell quite a bit. But they are lovely, very lovely animals. And obviously, historically, we've had them as part of different cultures, typically associated with aspects of cunning. So, for example, the kitsune, which is the Japanese shape-shifting fox, often fooling men. There are the foxes that act as the guardians of Japanese gods associated with grain and fertility. There are Aesop's fables where quite often some animals are trying to trick each other, including the fox, which is the trickster. And my personal favourite is the slightly poetic Firefox. So how many of you still use Firefox as a browser? Anybody? Yeah, not anymore. Well, the Firefox actually comes from the Sami, the local indigenous Finns in the north, that believed that the aurora borealis was made by the firefox's tail as it ran across the sky. And so the actual Firefox symbol is of the aurora borealis. So there you go, you've learned something new. It's very poetic. I like that a lot. So we've used foxes as gods in stories, often hinting at their cunning and their beauty. And of course, we use foxes in everyday life. I sure as hell don't remember the Audi fox. I guess I'm too young for that. But typically we're playing upon both that adaptability or cleverness, that kind of rogue spirit, but also their cuddliness, their soft and sexiness. You know, Jimi Hendrix had the song Foxy Lady, and of course that's passed into parlance. To be honest, I'm not sure a picture of a fox makes me want to buy that toilet roll, but I guess you get the imagery of the softness. And of course they also lend their name to other animals, both physically, so things like foxtail lilies, the foxtail palms, because they've got a kind of foxy brush, flying foxes or fox sparrows and fox squirrels because of the colour. The fox snakes is a good one, not because it looks like a fox, it's because it smells like a fox, apparently. And of course, my personal favourite, which took me a long time to realise, the foxglove gets its name because we believe the foxes wore them on the paws. It's a bit of a weird image now you think about it. Why is it called a foxglove? Because they used to wear the flowers as gloves. Not sure they really did. So the fox often lends its name to other animals. Ultimately, what do we think of foxes? Well, to be honest, we like them. Even in areas where there are diseases, like in Europe with Echinococcus multilocularis, people are generally like them or ambivalent to them. There's a lot of polarized views. They are loved and hated in equal measure, and I guess there are these perpetual mistruths that give them a bad press. Culturally, foxes are a really important part of many cultures, including our culture. And in reality, yeah, people like them. So it's often a small minority that perhaps are vocal. And where should you go for more information? So I would say that the most readable of these books is actually the Urban Foxes. There's Whitted series. Hard to find these days, but there's an Urban Fox series and also a Rural Fox series that are really good introductions to fox natural histories. Very readable. If you're looking for something slightly more academic, the Bible is The Red Fox from 1980 by H.G. Lloyd, or there's a book chapter that I wrote in 2010. And if you can really hold on your horses, I just completed the updated Handbook of European Mammals. I've completed the Red Fox chapter, which will be the most updated source of information on red foxes for Europe. I hasten to add, I don't receive any money for any of these endorsements. It's just purely from an academic perspective. But I really would recommend the Whitted books. The Urban Fox books are full of quirky drawings, nice anecdotes, and really accessible natural history. And that's it. Thank you for your undivided attention for these 2 hours. I filled them, and I hope that you've come away with a new appreciation of red foxes. Whether you like them or love them, I don't think it really matters. Just a new appreciate them as a really funky species that are super adaptable and, yeah, good at what they do. So thank you. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions. I'll stop sharing now and return to the main screen. Yeah, please fire away. You can put them in the chat. You can put your mic on. I don't mind.
I was really surprised by the 3-year lifespan. Is that because would they be able to live longer in other conditions, or is that because they will get like a disease or they'll get run over or something like that?
They're just naturally short-lived. There's a record from a friend in Holland of a 12-year-old red fox, a wild 12-year-old fox. But no, just in reality, I mean, it's live fast, die young. They reproduce at age 1, and there's so many other sources of mortality. So many of them get killed on the road. They can be they catch diseases. They can be shot in rural areas. There's just so much natural mortality out there potentially that causes a short lifespan. So it's just what they are. It's not artificially low. That is how long they live. I mentioned I would show you some skulls. While someone's thinking of some questions, I thought so instead I've got a wolf skull. So it's quite bright. So this is that's the end of my my computer. Let's put the jaw back on. So this is a relatively small Mongolian wolf skull, and this is a coyote skull. This is quite a large coyote. This would be around about 15 to 16 kilos. So this is twice the fox. This is quite a small female wolf. This is about 25 kilos. So this wolf would be more equivalent to the kind of skull your dog would have. And this is a fox. So you can see how much smaller and tinier it is. And you can see that it's just not as heavy built. There are smaller areas for muscle attachment by comparison. You know, it's a lot more narrower as well. So turn around the same way. You know, it's a lot slimmer in comparison. So these are really small animals. I should show you another skull. So I've got a male that I found who died. This was actually Bubble, the male. This one here I'm holding is Fango, Fango 3276. He was my first study animal. That's why I love him. He actually was, he means mud in Italian. This was Bubble. He was a large male fox. I don't know if you can see the top of his skull. You notice I'll find my camera. You can see there's a chip of bone taken out. This was probably caused by another male fox. So if you pass, you can see, if I do it from the back, they actually pass the canine straight through the ridge of the sagittal crest. So clearly, this male at some point during contest behavior had another fox bite the top of his head. And you can see as well, this bit of bone it's fixed, so it's healed. So it's showing that even with quite bad injuries, they can heal quite nicely. So those are those skulls. I have loads of other ones as well. I think skulls are incredibly fascinating things to have. Any more questions?
Thank
Joanna,
you.
Sorry, go ahead.
Your talk was really fascinating. Thank you. I was just wondering, what are the pest control people who want to shoot foxes? Are there actually any actual problems that they actually pose, urban foxes?
I mean, foxes can be a local area. So if you know, for example, had chickens and they kept being predated, well, a lazy person's way out would be to go and shoot the fox. It might be that they're fouling in an area. You know, cubs could be annoying. So there's a lot of people are surprisingly sensitive. It's not everybody, it's a minority, but some people can be incredibly sensitive to having any animal in their garden. And the foxes fall foul of that. I remember not long after I left Bristol, there was a lady who wrote to the Bristol Evening Post, and it was a letter where she was outraged that there were bumblebees in her garden pollinating flowers. And it finished with the immortal rant, if I want to see wildlife, I'll go to the countryside. And what can you do? That's the point. You're kind of fighting against some people who just don't like animals in any shape or form. For them, it's just abhorrent that they dare. Look at the presence of plastic grass in people's gardens. you know, that shows a real lack of any kind of nature loving. So that's the kind of place where those animals might potentially be shot or killed. There are a couple of real specialists for urban foxes. There's a guy called Bruce Lindsay. I think he's got a double-barreled name. He's usually, he's quite a big chap with a bald head. He invariably appears in the media if he needs some business. Fox shooting is booming, he says. I kill 20 a night, whatever, you know, he says. But, you know, he often appears in the media, for example. I'd say discharging a firearm in an urban area would also be a bit questionable, to be honest. But yes, you know, people, if you've got an animal that's in conflict with you, lethal control might be one potential solution. Personally, I think there are probably other solutions you can take, but some people want to go down that route.
Thank you. Yeah.
If the fox from a particular urban area is shot or killed, would another fox then not just go into that territory anyway if it's vacant? So it kind of just keeps the pest control people in business.
Yeah, I think you've highlighted the flaw in the plan. You know, there are foxes that are looking for vacancies at all time, and so removing an individual will only, it might temporarily move the problem, but yes, somebody else will move in. I think you can need to divorce that from the general removal of foxes versus the removal of a problem animal. You know, if you've got an animal that's a real pest, you could remove it. The replacement might be less of an issue. So you can look at it in that two ways, but you're never going to eradicate the foxes from that area. To be honest, if you really want to try and stop a fox coming into your garden, you need to think about securing your garden. You need to look at those kind of more proactive solutions. And there are ways of doing it, making it less friendly, removing food sources. You know, these animals can jump very high. So perhaps look at your fencing, close any gaps. They're lazy. You know, if there's no food in your garden and there's a 7 foot high or a 6 foot high fence, it's probably not going to come into your garden very often. But if your garden's full of food, lots of resting sites, places to breed, and you've got a fence with like Swiss cheese that it can go through, you're asking for trouble. So there are different alternates in terms of management, and we obviously should think more about the non-lethal approach, but you know, we have to accept lethal is one of the things that could be used.
Just another question. In terms of, we see quite a lot of reports in like marine animals and things like that of like rise in the amount of like plastic and stuff in their stomachs and stuff when they die. With foxes being kind of opportunists, has there been any trends in sort of seeing any kind of increase in plastic or anything like that in their diet, in their stomachs or anything like that?
Good question. I don't think anyone's looked at it, not systematically and not in a way that has quantified a change. What I would say is they've always had bits of rubbish in their stomachs. So certainly whenever I've looked, they've eaten things, you know, they could eat foil wrapping. They've eaten, dare I say it, there has been the odd contraceptive appear in a fox stomach. You know, they will eat anything they get their teeth into. But no, I don't know of any that showed there's an increase in this. And what I would suspect is their food sources have probably not changed too much in terms of the plastic. You know, as scavengers, they get a lot of food off of compost. You know, they might eat a bit of string that was attached to some chicken or whatever. So, you know, they probably always had that in their stomachs. So whether it's increased or not, I don't know though.
Cool, thank you. It was really fascinating talk. It was so good.
What I should say, because it's slightly linked to what Joanna said, is that, you know, they live short lives. They do find the most creative ways of dying. I've seen foxes slip jumping over a fence and get their heads jammed between slats and break their necks. They get run over by trains, electrocuted, poisoned. They get all kind of manner of stuff. One thing I did notice, and actually I had a discussion with some colleagues about this a while ago. There was a tendency I noticed that if a fox got run over but survived, you know, it could recover. But there was a tendency it got run over again, usually in a relatively short time period. And I was discussing with my colleagues at the time whether this actually might be some evidence of you know, a cognitive decline. some of these animals have lived in these territories with big roads for long times. Perhaps if this sudden appearance of risk of being run over was actually indicative of a cognitive decline, I don't know, but it was always very noticeable. If it got hit once and survived, it might not survive the second time. But yeah, foxes found incredibly creative ways of getting themselves in trouble. They really do.
You mentioned at the beginning about the raccoon dog fox, and saying that that's an invasive species.
Potentially, yeah. It's an invasive species in Europe.
Okay. Have they been trying to control the breeding and and killing it to stop it spreading, or are they just sort of letting it?
It's a bit of a challenge, raccoon dogs. There is some active management, but it's not systematic. It's patchy across Europe. They tend to be a problem because they act as rabies vectors, and they also have a hibernation cycle, so they hibernate, and that makes them quite challenging because, of course, they can hibernate with rabies. So you have something that disappears for 6 months and pops up again with it. So it's a problem in some local area, in some areas of Europe, as a rabies vector. But yes, they are being controlled in some places, but they're still spreading. I believe they've had raccoon dogs now down in Italy, which is a southern kind of westerly route, which they've moved. But Europe's got a range of invasive species like that. I mean, Germany's got raccoons as well, for example. There's North American mink. Some people would say that the spread of golden jackals as well, they're invasive. They're not. They're native. They're just spreading naturally. But there's those mesocarnivore communities in Europe are quite dynamic at the moment.
Looking at sort of their diet and things, is there ever any conflict between foxes and badgers, probably in more rural areas?
Really good question. So yes, there is. There's a little bit of dietary displacement, and we know this actually from the badger culling experiment that was run during the 90s. So what was known as the Krebs trial culled badgers in set areas, and what they found is that there was a release on the foxes in those areas, and their densities increased, and that was probably caused by reduced competition specifically for earthworms. So it probably positively impacted the survival of fox cubs, and probably has less of an impact on the adults, although they'll take earthworms. It's obviously not such a key component, but certainly on fox cubs. So yes, there is some dietary competition. It's not massive though. They can live in the same area. It's only some food items that they overlap a little bit with. Other mesocarnivores in Europe, there's much greater overlap. And as I say, things like golden jackal would be one where I'd expect quite a lot of conflict for food sources.
Thank you.
If you think which one's the dominant, badgers are the dominant ones. I've seen badgers beat up foxes. I mean, badgers are huge. Badgers are, don't mess with a badger. I say they're lovely animals. They all have distinct personalities. I had favourite foxes. I had, ones that I adored to bits, ones that I were upset when they died, ultimately. In fact, there's one fox that I'm very sad that the radio collar failed, and I have no idea what happened to her. She was absolutely my favourite of all time. So they have their own distinct personalities, and you do, working with them, build up a relationship. She was great. She had a partner fox. The male fox was called Chaos, and being a typical male, he was fairly brain dead. The males are not very smart, I hasten to add. They certainly seem to lack brain cells. And he was called Chaos because, first of all, I went to go and catch him. The door of the trap fell off. He could have escaped. No, he just sat there. So I quickly panicked, put the door back on, picked up the trap door again, fell off again. Just sat there looking at he could have escaped. I wasn't going to grab him. So he was just chaos. And typical male, your big males, you catch them and you take them out, and they were just so passive. You have a vixen or a small male, incidentally, small males and vixens, jumping up and down, really aggressive. Males, no, just pussycats. But yeah, that fox, Chaos, and the female Kester, they had a son called Pandemonium. And yeah, see, got names for all of them. And Pandemonium met a very unfortunate end. So he was one of my study animals as well. He moved to a different area of the city. He dispersed, and he got run over. And he had ear tags, which we used for identification. This lady rang me up, reported the number, and so I jumped in the car, zoomed there. I must have been only 10 minutes. It wasn't very far away. By the time I got there was no body. Okay, maybe he wasn't dead. This lady jumped out of the house and said, "Oh, this man came." Man? Said, yeah, he was on his bicycle. He stopped. He picked the fox up, tied it to his bicycle, and cycled off. That was the last I ever saw of Pandemonium. That fox had a radio collar on it with a radio transmitter, and I went round that city looking for that dead fox, and I never found it. So I have no idea what this man was doing with my study animal. I've always pictured that this animal was somewhere stuffed with a radio collar and ear tags in it. I just don't know. Never found it. Couldn't find it. Poor Pandemonium.
That's very weird.
He cycled off with it. I mean, what people must have just taken a glance at this presumably kind of blood dripping from this fox. I have no idea. It must have been a very weird sight. Saying that, you're going to post this now on YouTube, and I'm going to get an email from somebody.
I mean, this story's been edited out, I feel.
I have no idea who it is, but it just bizarreness. And that was the end of Pandemonium. I never saw him again.
Has anyone else got any questions? Real good. Okay.
I say we shouldn't forget foxes are pests. They do cause damage. They are, conservation threats in Australia. They could be threats to ground nesting birds. As much as I love them, we should look for non-lethal alternatives, but ultimately they can be problems and they can be pests. And so, lethal solution is part of any management, even for foxes. We shouldn't forget that. I'm hoping I answered all your questions in the talk. Yeah, Joanna said, yeah, we'll be here till past, overwhelmed with questions.
No, it was a brilliant talk. Thank you so much, Carl. If anyone has follow-up questions, please send them to me and I can send them on to Carl for you. And like I said, this has been recorded, and we can put it up on the Wildlife Trust page. And if it's all right, Carl can send me the slides over and I can share them with you.
Yep, I'm happy to send the PDF across, don't worry. Yeah, happy to.
So yeah, you guys will get all of that. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. I know it's been a really nice evening